Ethan Parker had always believed that memories fade with time. But on that quiet October afternoon, as the bus rolled past the maple trees of his old hometown, he realized some memories don't fade, they wait. He hadn't been back to Maplewood in over 2 decades. The small town was still wrapped in the same golden calmness he remembered. Yet everything felt slightly smaller, quieter, as if it too had grown older while waiting for him to return. Ethan pressed his forehead to the cold glass window. Watching the familiar streets pass by, Main Street's bakery still stood. The flower shop still had its crooked sign. And just beyond the square stood the old public library. The library. That was the heart of every memory he'd ever cherished as a boy. The bus came to a stop, and he stepped off, his suitcase in one hand, his laptop bag slung across his shoulder. A light breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves and rain-soaked pavement. The air was cool, but beneath the chill, something warm stirred, a mix of nostalgia and quiet fear. Ethan was 35 now, a writer who'd spent years in busy cities, surrounded by deadlines and screens. Success had brought him comfort, but not peace. Lately, the city's noise had started to feel hollow, and the blank page had begun to feel heavier than ever. When his company offered him a few months of remote work, he'd taken it without hesitation. He told his colleagues it was for a change of scenery. But in truth, he'd come back for something deeper, something he couldn't name. He made his way down the old streets, the sound of his footsteps echoing faintly. Children's laughter drifted from a nearby park, and for a fleeting second, he saw himself among them, a boy with a backpack too big for his shoulders, running toward the library after school. Back then, the library had been his refuge. It was where he learned to dream, where he discovered that words could build worlds, and where one kind woman had once changed the direction of his heart without ever realizing it. Her name came back to him, like a whisper. Clara Bennett. She had been the librarian when he was 12, a woman with calm eyes, soft-spoken wisdom, and an almost magical ability to make stories come alive. She had encouraged him to write his first short story and had been the first person to tell him, "You have a gift. Ethan, don't let the world take that from you." He never forgot that sentence. As he reached the steps of the library, Ethan paused. The building looked almost the same, its red brick walls a little faded, ivy creeping up the corners, and the same arched wooden doors standing tall and proud. But something about it felt different, like a chapter waiting to be reopened. He hesitated at the entrance, his heart unexpectedly heavy. Was she still here? After all these years, could Clara Bennett still be part of this place that shaped him so deeply? He had no idea. But his feet moved before his doubts could stop them. Inside, the familiar scent of books and dust wrapped around him. It felt like stepping into a forgotten dream. Shelves stretched up toward the ceiling, sunlight filtering through tall windows, painting soft patterns on the worn carpet. Everything was quiet, except for the hum of an old ceiling fan and the faint shuffle of pages. Turning somewhere nearby, Ethan walked slowly through the aisles, his fingers brushing against the spines of books he'd once read. The Secret Garden, Treasure Island, To Kill a Mockingbird. Each title brought back echoes of afternoons spent lost in stories while the world outside carried on without him. A young woman behind the desk looked up and smiled politely. "Can I help you find something, sir?" Ethan smiled back. "Just visiting old memories." She nodded, amused, and went back to her work. He continued deeper into the library, past the reading corner, until he reached the far side near the windows, his old spot. The small wooden table was still there, a little scratched, a little worn, but solid. He placed his hand on it gently, remembering the boy he had been, the one who sat there every afternoon trying to turn feelings into words, trying to understand why a certain librarian's voice could make his world feel bigger and safer all at once. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "That table has seen more stories than I can count." Ethan froze. The voice was soft, familiar, and warm, the kind of tone that carried patience and history. He turned slowly, standing a few feet away. Was a woman holding a stack of books. Her hair was touched with silver now, her face framed by kindness, and her eyes those same calm, steady eyes were unmistakable. "Clara," he whispered before he could stop himself. She blinked, surprised. "Ethan Parker." He laughed softly, almost in disbelief. "You remember? How could I forget?" She said with a smile that reached her eyes. "You were the boy who filled this library with dreams." For a moment, time seemed to pause. The dust in the sunlight danced like tiny stars, and Ethan felt something deep inside him stir a quiet, familiar warmth he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just nostalgia. It was connection, and as they stood there, surrounded by the soft hush of books and memories, Ethan realized something simple yet profound. Sometimes life brings us back to where we started, not to relive the past, but to find what we've lost along the way. He didn't yet know why he had truly returned, but he knew this meeting, this moment, was no accident. And in Clara's gentle smile, he felt the first spark of a story waiting to begin again. For a long moment, Ethan and Clara simply stood there, caught between the years that had passed and the familiarity that had never truly left. The library around them seemed to breathe softly, the quiet rustle of turning pages, the creak of wooden shelves, and the faint scent of rain drifting through the open window. Ethan felt like a boy again, standing before the woman who once gave his restless imagination a home. "You haven't changed much," Clara said with a small laugh, breaking the silence. "Still thoughtful, still staring at things like they're holding a secret." Ethan smiled, his voice steady but filled with warmth. "And you still remember more than anyone else." They walked together toward the front desk. The years between them melted away, replaced by an ease that felt almost sacred. A quiet understanding that didn't need to be explained. Clara poured them both a cup of tea from a small pot kept behind the counter. The gesture felt familiar. He remembered those rainy afternoons when she'd do the same. Back when he was too shy to talk, but always too curious to leave, you know? She said as they sat at a small table by the window. "I still have one of your old stories in the archives. The one about the boy who wanted to live inside a book." Ethan laughed softly, shaking his head. "That was terrible writing." She raised an eyebrow. "Maybe, but it was honest. That's what I liked about it." He looked at her then, really looked, and saw the same gentleness in her eyes, though touched now with experience and a hint of weariness. She'd grown older, yes, but there was something about her presence that hadn't dimmed. It was as if time had been kind enough to keep her essence untouched. He wanted to ask about her life, what happened after he left town, whether she ever stopped working here, but something about her quiet demeanor told him that she, too, carried her own collection of memories, carefully shelved and left unopened. Instead, he said, "Do you ever miss the old days?" Clara smiled, tracing her finger along the rim of her cup. "Every once in a while. Especially when I see someone sitting in your old spot, lost in a story. It reminds me that the things we love don't really leave us. They just change shape." Her words lingered in the air, soft and meaningful. Ethan nodded slowly. "I think that's why I came back. Everything started here, my love for writing, my belief that stories matter. You gave me that." She looked slightly surprised. "I did." "You did," he said quietly. "You were the first person who made me believe I could do something with words." Clara's eyes softened. "I only gave you encouragement. You did the rest." He smiled faintly, but there was something deeper behind it. Gratitude mixed with a quiet ache he couldn't name. Because the truth was, back then, she had been more than a mentor. To a 12-year-old boy trying to make sense of the world, she was a symbol of grace, kindness, and warmth, the kind of person who made him feel safe. And now, sitting across from her years later, that warmth returned like sunlight after a long winter. Outside, the afternoon light began to fade, and the sound of rain against the windows filled the silence between them. Clara glanced toward the clock. "It's strange," she said softly. "When I started working here, I thought I'd only stay for a few years. But somehow this place became my whole life. Do you regret it?" Ethan asked gently. She hesitated before answering. "No, but sometimes I wonder if I stayed because I loved books, or because I was afraid of what life might be like beyond them." The honesty in her voice struck something deep in him. He understood that fear, the way comfort can quietly become a cage, the way dreams can grow smaller with time. "I know that feeling," he said. "I've spent years chasing deadlines, publishing stories I barely recognized as mine. And yet none of it feels as real as sitting here does." She smiled faintly. "Maybe that's life reminding us to slow down, to look back at the things that shaped us." Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, the years between them didn't exist. There was only understanding, simple, wordless, and pure. When the rain stopped, the sky outside had turned golden. Light streamed through the tall windows, reflecting in the quiet of the room. Ethan stood and looked around at the shelves filled with stories, at the table that had once been his refuge, and at the woman. The next morning, Ethan woke early. Sunlight poured through the curtains of his small rental apartment, painting gold stripes across the floor. For a moment, he just lay there, listening to the sound of the town waking, a dog barking, a car door closing, the faint whistle of a distant train. He hadn't realized how quiet life could be until he came back here. There was peace in this silence, but also a strange restlessness. He couldn't stop thinking about Clara, her smile, her calm voice, the way she seemed both unchanged and yet somehow different. He told himself it was only nostalgia, a trick of memory. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. He made coffee and sat by the window with his notebook, trying to write, but the words refused to come. Every sentence felt forced, hollow. So, after a few restless minutes, he grabbed his jacket and walked toward the library. When he arrived, the sky was gray again, heavy with clouds. Inside the library was nearly empty except for a few students scattered at the tables. The soft tapping of rain against the windows began once more, like a familiar rhythm calling him back. Clara was at the far end arranging books in the children's section. She looked up as he entered, and her face lit up with a surprised smile. "Back so soon?" she asked warmly. "I couldn't stay away," Ethan admitted, his tone light but honest. She laughed softly. "Writers do love their quiet corners." He hesitated, then said, "I brought something." From his bag, he pulled out a worn notebook, the same one she had once encouraged him to keep when he was 12. Its pages were yellowed and filled with faded pencil marks. "You still have it?" Clara said, her voice touched with emotion. "I never could throw it away," he replied. "You told me stories were worth keeping, even the unfinished ones." Her eyes glistened with a quiet pride. "I said that." "You did, and I've lived by it ever since." They shared a small smile that said more than words could, a silent acknowledgement of how deeply one person's kindness can shape another's life. Later that afternoon, a sudden power flicker dimmed the lights in the library. There was a soft gasp from one of the younger readers as the room briefly went dark. Clara moved to check the front desk, but Ethan followed, helping her steady a stack of books that almost slipped. Their hands brushed just for a second, and both froze, surprised by the spark of warmth that passed between them. It wasn't romantic in the dramatic sense. It was human, a reminder that connection, even after years, can live quietly beneath the surface. When the lights flickered back on, Clara looked at him with a half smile. "Still the hero," she teased gently. He chuckled. "I think I was just in the right place." She tilted her head. "You always were." The words lingered between them as the day wore on. Rain poured harder outside. The library grew quieter, the soft patter on the windows creating a rhythm that matched their conversation. They spoke about books, about the changing town, about how time had a way of reshaping people. But then, in a pause between laughter, Ethan asked something he hadn't planned to. "Why did you stay, Clara? You're so full of life and knowledge. You could have gone anywhere, done anything." She was silent for a moment, then said quietly, "I did leave once. For a while." Ethan looked at her, surprised. "You did?" "Yes," she said, her gaze distant. "I went to the city for a teaching position. It was everything I thought I wanted. Noise, energy, ambition. But after a few years, I realized something was missing. I missed the stillness, the meaning in small moments. So, I came back. Her words carried a depth he could feel more than understand. There was a story behind that decision. One she didn't tell fully and maybe didn't need to. I think you came back to the right place, he said softly. Clara looked at him and smiled. But this time, there was something bittersweet in it. And what are you looking for, Ethan? He hesitated, glancing around at the rows of books, the quiet corners that had once been his world. Maybe I'm looking for the boy I used to be, he said finally. The one who believed words could change everything. She studied him with a kind of affection that only time could create. Maybe you don't have to find him. Maybe he never left. Her response hit deeper than she could have known. It was the sort of truth that lingers, simple, profound, and healing. As evening approached, the rain stopped and the sun broke through the clouds, spilling a warm golden light through the tall windows. Dust floated in the glow like tiny stars. Clara began locking up, and Ethan helped her close the heavy front doors. When they stepped outside, the air was crisp, the scent of rain mixing with autumn leaves. Do you ever feel, he asked as they walked down the steps, that certain places hold pieces of us, like the library remembers who we were? Clara smiled softly. I think places remember people just as people remember places. They paused at the gate. For a moment, neither spoke. The light caught in her hair. The faint breeze carried the scent of rain and old books. I'm glad you came back, Ethan, she said quietly. This library missed you. He smiled faintly, but there was emotion in his voice when he replied, maybe it wasn't the library I missed. Clara's eyes met his calm, kind, knowing. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she said gently, sometimes life gives us second chances to finish the chapters we left open. Ethan nodded slowly, the words sinking deep into his heart, and as he walked home that evening, he felt it, that twist of fate, that quiet shift where past and present meet. It wasn't just coincidence that brought him here. It was something larger, something that whispered softly through the corridors of time. Some stories aren't over yet. The days that followed passed gently, almost like pages turning in a favorite old book. Ethan began visiting the library nearly every afternoon. Sometimes he came with his notebook and laptop. Other times he came with nothing but the quiet hope of seeing Clara. She never asked why he returned so often, and he never offered an explanation. Instead, they settled into a rhythm, comfortable, wordless, almost sacred. She worked among the shelves, and he sat by the same window where he had once dreamed as a boy. Outside, autumn deepened. The maple trees burned red and gold, and the air carried a hint of winter's breath. Inside, the library stayed warm and steady, a world untouched by the noise beyond its doors, but beneath the peaceful surface. Both of them felt something stirring, something that neither dared to name. One afternoon, Ethan found Clara sitting alone at the front desk, reading an old book with a frayed cover. Is that one of the classics? He asked, walking closer. She smiled without looking up. It's The Wind in the Willows. I've read it a dozen times. But some stories, they comfort you differently each time you return to them. Ethan leaned against the desk, watching her quietly. I think people can be that way too. Clara glanced up, her expression thoughtful. You mean how they come back into your life, changed, but familiar? He nodded. Exactly. She closed the book gently, her fingers brushing the worn pages. Maybe that's what you and I are, 2 chapters revisited. The simplicity of her words struck him more deeply than he expected. He smiled, but it was tinged with emotion. I think you might be right. Soft silence settled between them, the kind that carries both comfort and ache. That evening, the library was nearly empty. The rain had returned, tapping lightly against the tall windows. Creating a rhythm that filled the room, Clara stood by the shelves, reshelving books. Ethan joined her, wordlessly taking a stack to help. Their movements were slow, almost in sync, as if they had done this 1,000 times before. Do you ever think about the past? He asked suddenly. She hesitated before answering. Sometimes, but only when it finds me first. He looked at her curiously. Find you. Clara smiled faintly. Memories have a way of returning when you least expect them. A smell, a sound, a familiar face. He could tell she was speaking carefully, choosing each word like it mattered. Do you ever regret anything? He asked quietly. She paused, sliding a book into place. I try not to live with regret, she said softly. But there are moments I wish I had been braver, that I'd said more when silence felt easier. Ethan's heart tightened. He understood that better than she could know. I think I know what you mean, he said. Sometimes silence feels safer, but it can also leave the most important things unsaid. Their eyes met, steady, searching, and in that quiet space, something wordless passed between them. A recognition, an unspoken truth that had been waiting for years to surface. The clock above the desk ticked softly. Outside, the rain grew heavier, streaking the windows like silver threads. Clara finally spoke. When you were young, Ethan, I always knew you'd become a writer. You had this tenderness about you. You saw beauty in small things, in details others missed. That's rare. Her voice carried warmth, but also something deeper, something fragile. Ethan's chest ached with emotion. You were the reason I believed in that part of myself. You gave me the courage to keep going when I wanted to quit. Clara smiled softly. Then maybe we saved each other a little without realizing it. He watched her closely, the way her expression softened, the faint sadness in her eyes. He wondered if life had ever given her the same encouragement she had given him. There were 1,000 questions he wanted to ask. Were you happy? Did you ever fall in love? Did you ever miss me? But the words never made it past his lips. Instead, he said quietly, I wish I had told you how much you meant to me back then. Clara looked at him for a long moment. The next morning, the rain finally stopped. The world outside looked freshly washed, streets shining, trees glistening, and the air filled with the scent of damp earth. Ethan sat by his apartment window, coffee in hand, his thoughts circling the same quiet truth he'd been avoiding. He had come back to his hometown for peace, maybe closure. But instead, he had found Clara, the woman whose kindness had once shaped his heart. And now, seeing her again had stirred something that had never truly faded. He didn't know what he wanted or what he was allowed to want, but he knew he couldn't keep pretending his visits were just about nostalgia. So that day, he decided to go back to the library, not as the man revisiting his past, but as someone ready to face it. When he walked in, the afternoon light poured through the windows like soft gold. Clara stood by the return desk, sorting through a small stack of returned books. She looked up and smiled, that same warm, steady smile that had always calmed him. Back again. She teased gently. He smiled faintly. I guess I can't stay away. She chuckled. That's becoming a pattern. Ethan hesitated before speaking. Do you have a few minutes? There's something I'd like to show you. Clara raised a curious eyebrow, but nodded. Of course. He led her toward the reading nook, the one by the tall window that overlooked the park. He pulled out a small notebook from his bag. It was worn, its pages filled with handwriting. I've been writing something, he said softly. It's not finished, but I want you to read a part of it. Clara smiled kindly, taking the notebook from his hands. It's a new story. He nodded. In a way, it's an old one. She opened the notebook carefully, flipping to the page he'd marked. The room was quiet, only the faint hum of the ceiling fan and the rustle of pages turning as she read. Ethan watched her face, the small changes in her expression, the way her lips curved gently at certain lines, the way her eyes softened with recognition. When she finished, she looked up. Ethan, she whispered, her voice almost breaking. This story, it's us. He swallowed hard. It is. She closed the notebook gently, holding it against her chest. All this time, you remembered. I never forgot, he said quietly. I tried to, but I couldn't. You were the first person who believed in me, really believed. And when life got hard, I'd think of those afternoons here, the way you used to tell me that stories mattered. You made me believe that I mattered." Clara's eyes glistened. "You did matter. You always did." Ethan took a slow breath. "Then why does it still feel like there's something unfinished between us?" For a moment, she didn't answer. The silence stretched, not empty, but full of memory. Finally, Clara said softly, because Ethan's heart tightened. "Then maybe it's time we stopped leaving it unfinished." Clara looked at him with a mixture of tenderness and sorrow. "Ethan, life isn't as simple as stories. You went out into the world, you built something for yourself. And I stayed here guarding a place full of memories." He shook his head gently. "It's not about the years or the distance. It's about what's real, what's always been real." Her voice trembled slightly. "And what if what's real can't fit into the lives we've built?" He took a step closer, his tone steady but full of emotion. "Then maybe we find a way to make room for it. Even if it's just as truth, not promises, not expectations. Just truth." Clara stood still, her eyes searching his. And then, softly, she said the words she had carried for years. "When you left town all those years ago," she began, "I came to the library the next morning and sat right where you used to sit. I told myself it was just another day, but it wasn't. The space felt different, quieter, emptier. You had become part of this place, and when you left, it felt like the light went with you." Ethan's breath caught Dot. Clara continued, her voice breaking slightly. "You were just a boy then, and I was older, with responsibilities I couldn't step outside of. But the way you saw the world, the kindness, the hope, it changed me. I never said it aloud because it wasn't right and it wasn't time. But I cared for you deeply, Ethan. I always did." The words hung between them like fragile glass, shimmering delicate and real. Ethan's eyes filled with tears he didn't try to hide. "You don't know how much I needed to hear that." Clara smiled softly, her own tears glinting. "And you don't know how long I needed to say it." They stood there quietly, side by the window. The afternoon sun painting gold across the wooden floor. Ethan finally spoke, his voice low. "So, what now?" Clara looked out at the park, where leaves drifted gently in the breeze. "Maybe now we stop pretending the past didn't matter. Maybe we just let it be what it was, something good, something rare." He nodded slowly. "And maybe we let it remind us that some connections never fade, even if they change." Clara turned to him, her expression soft, peaceful. "That sounds like a story worth keeping." That evening, as Ethan walked home, his heart felt both heavy and light. The truth had finally been spoken, not for closure, not for endings, but for understanding. The ache was still there, yes, but it no longer felt like regret. It felt like gratitude for the time they'd shared, for the words finally set free, for the truth that had waited so patiently to be heard. And as he passed beneath the golden leaves, he realized something simple but profound. Sometimes the turning point in a story isn't about what begins or ends. It's about the courage to finally speak what was always true. The week after their heartfelt conversation, the library seemed warmer, brighter, as if the walls themselves recognized the truths that had finally been spoken. Ethan's visits became less about seeking courage and more about sharing. Quiet moments with Clara. They sat together at the window table, drank tea, and spoke of simple things. The changing seasons, the books they loved, the small events that made each day memorable. Yet, even in the calm, there was a gentle electricity, a reminder that their connection had not disappeared with time. It had been waiting, patient and unwavering. One afternoon, Clara suggested a walk through the park behind the library. The autumn air was crisp, the ground covered with a mosaic of red and gold leaves. Ethan followed her along the familiar path, listening to the crunch of leaves beneath their feet. He had spent years walking busy city streets, chasing deadlines and recognition, but this quiet, shared space felt like something far more important. "You know," Clara said softly, "I used to think life was just about moments like these. Small, ordinary moments. But the ordinary can hold more meaning than we realize." Ethan nodded. Think I understand that now. It's the small things, the books, the quiet afternoons, the kindness of people we care about that shape us the most. She glanced at him, her eyes warm. Glad you came back, Ethan. Not just to the library, but here, to this moment, to us. The words hung between them like sunlight filtering through the trees. As they walked, they passed the bench, where he had once sat as a boy, scribbling stories into his notebook. It was still there, worn but steady, waiting like a silent witness to decades of growth and change. He paused and rested his hand on the back of the bench. I used to think I would forget this place when I left town, he said quietly. But I never did. And seeing you again feels like coming home in more ways than one. Clara smiled, a gentle curve of her lips that held both joy and quiet sorrow. Home isn't always a building, Ethan. Sometimes it's a person. And maybe it was always meant to be that way for us. For a long moment, neither spoke. They simply walked together, side by side, letting the words they had shared linger in the crisp air. The days passed, and Ethan knew his time in Maplewood was drawing to a close. The thought of leaving weighed heavily on him, but the honesty they had shared made the idea less painful. On his last evening, Clara invited him to the library one final time. The golden light of sunset streamed through the tall windows, casting long, warm shadows across the wooden floors. They stood by the window table, the same one that had witnessed countless stories, old and new. Clara handed him a small envelope. "What's this?" he asked. "Just a note," she said softly, smiling. "Something to remember this time by." Ethan opened it carefully. Inside was a simple handwritten letter. "Ethan, you've always believed in the magic of stories, and in that, you've reminded me of the magic in life. Thank you for coming back, not just to the library, but to the moments we never fully said aloud. Keep writing, keep dreaming, and remember that some connections never truly fade." Ethan looked up at her, emotions rising in his chest. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to," she said gently. "Promise me you'll keep living the story you've always wanted." He smiled a little, choked, and nodded. "I promise." The next morning, Ethan packed his belongings and walked through the town one last time. Maplewood had changed subtly. New signs on shops, a few new faces, but the essence of the town remained. And somewhere in its quiet streets, the library stood, holding stories, memories, and a small, enduring truth. He arrived at the library to say goodbye. Clara was waiting, as always, by the front desk. Their eyes met, and in that look was everything unspoken: gratitude, respect, admiration, and a deep, lasting bond.